So question here, do you have any suggestions when working with commas? Sure. So commas are the most complicated mark just because there's many different uses for them. Let me do a quick overview of the most common uses for commas on the ACT. So ACT, common comma uses. Now this is not exhaustive, but this will give a pretty decent summary. So when it comes to commas, the first thing to point out is whether a comma should be used or not doesn't have much to do with things like pauses or breath. So sometimes in English classes, you're given the rule of thumb, use a comma when you should pause, or use a comma when you read a sentence and you feel like you should take a breath. It's not a bad rule of thumb for beginning writers, but especially on a standardized test, it can be unreliable. Instead, there are rules. There are rules and reasons why we use a comma here or we don't use a comma here. And for the purpose of this test, you want to know those rules. And a lot of those rules rely on sentence structure. So how is my sentence constructed? How is it connecting to other sentences, other complete or incomplete sentences? And so one of the most basic uses for a comma is to connect a complete sentence to an incomplete sentence. And so my sort of notation here, the little I means an incomplete sentence, like a phrase or something, and the capital C means a complete sentence, so a sentence that can stand on its own. So this right here, incomplete comma complete, complete comma incomplete, incomplete comma complete comma incomplete, like these are all legal, and especially this one, they're quite common. So attaching a complete sentence to an incomplete sentence, a phrase, one use for commas, one very common use for commas. Second common use is to connect complete sentences, but you need to use a conjunction, a fanboys conjunction. So complete, comma, fanboys conjunction, complete, that is another legal use. And so our fanboys conjunctions, this fanboy stands for and, nor, but, or, yet. And so, in order to connect two complete sentences, I have to use a comma with one of those fanboys. I cannot, this is a very common error, complete, comma, complete. This is wrong. This is a comma splice. Can't do it. Even if it sounds good. Again, even if it sounds like, oh, I paused there and it sounds good when I pause. It's not good enough. So complete, comma, complete, no good. Instead, you want to use the fanboys conjunction, or as the commenter said, you can use a period, you could use a semicolon, but you just can't use a single comma. And in terms of the single comma, this is about it. Are there other cases where you might use a single comma? Not really. Like these are the single comma cases. Separating an incomplete from a complete, or separating two complete sentences with a comma and a fanboys conjunction. There's a whole other bucket of commas which involve inserting sentences or phrases into the middle of sentences. And this is where you get into things like essential and non-essential phrases. So for example, So another whole category of commas is to insert this incomplete sentence into the middle of our complete sentence. Notice it's complete. It's one complete sentence that's kind of been pried open, and that incomplete phrase inserted into the middle of it. And in many cases, not all, but in many cases, you need to use two commas to separate that incomplete phrase. And this involves things like non-essential phrases, appositives, participial phrases, if any of that terminology sounds familiar. But for this, we need to insert that phrase into the middle of a sentence and surround it with commas. You can also use commas with lists. So when you have lists of things, you need to separate the elements of the list with commas. And there's commas involving quotations. Doesn't come up too often on the ACT English. But this is really about it. I mean, there's more rules than for, say, a colon or a semicolon, but there's not that many, really. And I think the complication with commas in particular comes with the fact that a sentence can have 3 or 4 or 5 commas all being used differently, but ultimately all being used following these rules. So if we have specific questions that you want to look at with commas, we can really break this down. But this is like the kernel. Obviously, there's more details and little things here and there, but if you kind of get this basic overview, the rest of the rules are just extra rules that build onto this. This is the core of the majority of comma errors on the test. And so notice it's nothing about what sounds good or pauses or breaths. It's understanding this is complete sentence, this is incomplete, I'm attaching these, how do I do that? That's what punctuation and commas in particular is all about. You mentioned in the chat, end is one of the more common fanboys conjunctions. So if there's other specific questions, we can take a look. But I think that gives a pretty good overview. And in the ACT English Bootcamp, there's a bunch more videos and examples of these sorts of things. So definitely check that one out. Yeah, okay. And dashes too. So let's just bring it all together. So this is from a reference sheet that I use with my tutoring students. When we insert a sentence, an incomplete sentence into the middle of our complete sentence, we can do so with commas surrounding it, or 2 dashes, or parentheses. And this is also a way to explain this idea that I call the 2 or none rule, where in these scenarios, you either need to have 2 commas or none. And the easy way to see that that's true is think of the parenthesis. You would never just have a single parenthesis just hanging out. Like, I told my friend, parenthesis Bob, the truth. And reading this, it doesn't make any sense. 1 parenthesis hanging out here. We need to close it. If I open the parenthesis, I need to close it. And the same thing is true if I have a comma here. I need to close it. If I have a dash here, I need to close it. It's the same idea because ultimately these commas, dashes, parentheses, they're doing the same thing. They're setting off this incomplete phrase, this non-essential extra information phrase from the main sentence. And so, we can use commas, we can use dashes, we can use parentheses, and make sure that you don't mix and match. So one of the errors you might see is maybe they'll use a dash there and a comma there, or vice versa. If you use a dash, you got to use a dash here. If you use a comma, you got to use a comma. You just got to be consistent.